The house Walter and Evelyn built with their own hands became the place where their lives were almost erased. One quiet morning, their children forced them into a car, stole their phones and wallets, and dumped two injured seniors on a blazing stretch of rural highway. No water, no help, just heat, pain, and the sound of cars rushing past without stopping. Walter counted them one by one until hope itself began to fracture. 19 chances for mercy. 19 times the world looked away. Then, at the edge of collapse, an 18-wheeler slowed. A truck driver with his own buried regret made a single choice that would expose a carefully hidden crime, tear apart a family built on blood, and create a new one built on choice. What followed was not just a fight for survival, but a reckoning about greed, dignity, and what family truly means. Before we begin, please let us know where you're listening from or how you're feeling right now, or simply write Amen for everything that truly matters. And if this story moves you, follow the channel and stay with us for more powerful stories of courage, justice, and unexpected kindness. Your support truly means a great deal to us. The Harlan farmhouse sat on a gentle rise of land in rural Missouri, weathered but stubbornly standing, much like the two people who had lived inside it for nearly half a century. The paint along the porch railings had faded to a soft gray, and the steps creaked in a familiar way that Walter Harlan always said sounded like the house clearing its throat before speaking. He had built those steps himself when their first child was born, cutting the wood with steady hands that no longer felt quite as strong as they once had. Walter was 73, a tall man who had thinned with age but not with dignity. His shoulders still held some of the breadth earned from decades of factory work, though now they sloped slightly forward, as if the weight of years pressed gently but constantly against him. His face was deeply lined, the kind of lines that came not from bitterness, but from long shifts, early mornings, and quiet endurance. His hair, once dark and thick, had retreated into a soft gray fringe around a mostly bare crown. He moved slower now, carefully, his lower back stiff most mornings, but he had refused, so far, to surrender to the idea that age alone should dictate his life. Evelyn Harlan, 71, moved through the house with a quieter rhythm. She was small, barely over 5 feet tall, slender in a way that suggested delicacy but concealed surprising strength. Her hair was white now, always pinned neatly at the back of her head, a habit formed during the 30 years she had taught Sunday school at the local church. Her skin was pale and finely lined, her hands narrow and steady, shaped by years of cooking, gardening, and gentle work. People often mistook Evelyn's softness for weakness. Those people did not know her. The kitchen bore Evelyn's imprint more than any other room. She had remodeled it twice with her own hands, choosing the cabinets, sanding them herself, repainting when money was tight. The garden outside the back window was her sanctuary, rows of vegetables, rose bushes along the fence, and an apple tree that still produced fruit every September. She tended it with the same quiet devotion others reserved for prayer. They were old, yes, slower, certainly, but they were not helpless. They paid their bills on time, cooked their meals, kept their house in order. They had never asked their children for anything. That was why the knock on the door that Sunday afternoon unsettled Walter before he even reached for the handle. Grant Harlan stood on the porch with his hands in the pockets of a tailored jacket, his posture straight, his expression carefully neutral. At 46, he looked every bit the successful professional he liked to believe himself to be. He was tall like his father, but broader through the chest, his build maintained more by gym memberships than labor. His hair was dark and neatly trimmed, his jaw clean-shaven, his eyes sharp with calculation rather than warmth. He smelled faintly of expensive cologne and impatience. He did not hug his mother. He did not ask his father how his back had been holding up. "I need to talk to you about the house," Grant said, stepping inside without waiting to be invited. The words landed like a chill across the room. Walter closed the door slowly and turned back, already uneasy. "What about the house?" Grant moved into the living room, glancing around as if appraising a property rather than entering his childhood home. He pulled a thin folder from under his arm and set it on the coffee table, aligning it carefully. "You're both getting older," Grant said, his voice measured, reasonable on the surface. "Mom forgot Melissa's birthday last month. Dad, you can barely get up the porch steps anymore. It's time to start thinking ahead." "We're not dead," Evelyn said from the kitchen doorway. Her voice was calm, but something in her eyes sharpened. "No one said you were," Grant replied, offering a tight smile. "But this property is worth a lot now. The land alone could attract developers. If you transfer the deed to us kids now, while you're still legally competent, it protects the asset." "Protects it from what?" Walter asked. "Nursing homes, medical bills, the government." Grant shrugged slightly. "You know how it works." Walter felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had worked 31 years on factory floors. He understood contracts. He understood leverage. He also understood when someone was speaking to him as if he were already diminished. "We'll think about it," Walter said carefully. "That's a big decision." Grant's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "There's nothing to think about." He opened the folder. Inside were neatly printed documents, legal language highlighted, places for signatures clearly marked. "I've already spoken to an attorney," Grant continued. "This transfers ownership to the three of us. You retain life rights. You can stay here as long as you're alive." Life rights. Permission to live in their own home. Evelyn stepped fully into the room then. She crossed to the table and closed the folder with one deliberate motion. "This is our house," she said, "not your inheritance." Grant's eyes flickered, irritation breaking through his composure. "We have a right to know what happens to what you leave behind." The word inheritance echoed in the room like a crack in glass. "I think you should leave," Evelyn said quietly. "Come back when you remember how to speak to your parents." For a moment, Grant looked as if he might argue. Then he stood, smoothing his jacket, his expression cool once more. "You're making this difficult," he said. "No," Walter replied. "You are." Grant left without another word. That night, Walter lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant chirp of crickets, the old boards shifting as they always had. But something felt different now. The walls that once held memories like pressed flowers seemed to lean inward, listening. Over the next days, the phone began to ring. Calls from Melissa, their middle child, her voice alternating between tears and accusation. Messages from Dean, the youngest, awkward and rehearsed, urging them to be practical. Each conversation circled the same point: the house, the land, the future. Walter began to understand the truth with a sinking certainty. They were not afraid for him and Evelyn. They were afraid of losing what they believed was already theirs. On Thursday evening, as the sun dipped low behind the apple trees, Evelyn stood at the kitchen sink and watched her reflection in the window. For the first time in years, she felt like a guest in her own home, and somewhere deep in the bones of the house, something old and trusted shifted, as if it knew what was coming. The calls began the morning after Grant left, as if his departure had been a signal rather than an ending. Walter was pouring coffee when the phone rang, its sharp sound cutting through the quiet kitchen. Evelyn was at the sink, hands in warm water, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested routine rather than fear. That would change. The voice on the other end belonged to Melissa Harlan Reeves, their middle child, and it arrived already trembling, already heavy with emotion. Melissa was 43, tall and carefully put together, with honey blonde hair she wore straight to her shoulders and a smile she deployed like a tool when it suited her. She had always been expressive, her feelings large and public, and over the years she had learned how easily tears could move people where reason failed. She spoke of family unity, of her own children needing stability, of how unfair it was that everything remained so uncertain. She cried, then accused, then cried again. Walter listened with a patience worn thin, offering little more than murmured acknowledgments. Evelyn stood beside him, silent, her eyes fixed on a spot just above the counter, already recognizing the pattern. By afternoon, the calls came from Dean. Dean Harlan, the youngest at 41, had never quite found his place. He was average in height, soft around the middle, with a beard he kept unevenly trimmed and eyes that rarely met yours for long. He dressed plainly, favored comfort over ambition, and carried himself with the air of a man perpetually apologizing for existing. When he spoke, it was halting, as if each sentence had been rehearsed and approved by someone else. "I'm just worried about you," he said. "Grant says this could get complicated. You don't want strangers making decisions for you." Walter could hear the borrowed language, the phrases that didn't belong to Dean. He also heard what wasn't said. Dean was afraid of conflict, of responsibility, of standing alone. Walter knew his son wasn't cruel. He was weak, and weakness, in the presence of someone like Grant, was dangerous. The days folded into each other with an exhausting sameness. The phone rang at odd hours. Messages stacked up unanswered. Evelyn stopped answering altogether, letting the machine take the weight of their children's voices. At night, the house felt different. The walls seemed closer, the familiar rooms charged with an unease Walter couldn't name. He found himself checking the locks twice before bed, a habit he'd never needed before. Evelyn noticed, said nothing. The final visit came on a Thursday morning, the kind that dawned bright and deceptively gentle. The apple tree outside the kitchen window cast dappled shadows across the floor. Evelyn was slicing bread when she heard tires on gravel. She looked up, her hand stilling mid-motion. 3 cars sat in the drive, lined neatly, deliberately. Grant's SUV in front, Melissa's sedan beside it, Dean's aging hatchback tucked behind. Walter felt the warning before the knock came. When it did, it was firm, confident, final. They entered together. The sight of all 3 children in the living room at once struck Walter with a clarity that bordered on dread. This wasn't a conversation. It was an operation. Grant took the center of the room, setting the familiar folder on the table with practiced ease. Melissa hovered near the sofa, arms crossed tightly, eyes already shining. Dean lingered near the door, hands in his pockets, as if he might leave at any second. Grant spoke first. His voice was calm, his posture relaxed, as though he were explaining an investment strategy rather than dismantling his parents' lives. "We've talked to another attorney," he said. "There are options if people refuse to act in their own best interest." He paused, letting the words settle. "Courts can appoint guardians. Evaluations can be ordered. Assets can be managed by someone competent." The room went quiet. Walter felt a hollow open in his chest. Evelyn straightened, setting the bread knife down with care. She was small beside her children, her white hair pinned neatly back, her hands slender and steady. She had fed them, taught them, prayed over them. Now she looked at them as if seeing strangers. "Get out of my house," she said. The words were soft but immovable. Grant's face changed. The patience evaporated, replaced by something sharp and ugly. "You don't get to dismiss us," he snapped, stepping closer. When he reached for Evelyn's arm, the motion was quick and forceful, his fingers digging into her bicep as he pulled her toward him. The sound she made, a short, startled cry, cut through Walter like glass. He moved without thinking. Years of factory work had left him stronger than he looked, and he shoved Grant away with both hands. Grant stumbled back, surprise flashing across his face before anger took its place. That was all it took. The room erupted. Dean lunged from behind, his weight knocking Walter off balance. Melissa screamed, her voice high and panicked, though she made no move to intervene. Grant recovered and swung, his fist connecting with the side of Walter's head. Walter fell hard, the world tilting as he hit the floor. Evelyn dropped beside him, her body instinctively shielding his. Someone kicked. Walter never knew who, and the blow landed in Evelyn's ribs with a sickening thud. The sounds that followed lodged themselves deep in Walter's mind, his wife's breath leaving her in a sharp gasp, the scrape of shoes on wood, Melissa's crying turning shrill and incoherent. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the violence burned itself out. Grant stood over them, chest heaving, his eyes cold and resolved. "Get them in the car," he said. Not a question, a decision. They were lifted, dragged, pushed toward the door. Walter's head rang. Evelyn clutched her side, tears streaking down her face. Their phones were taken, wallets stripped from pockets, keys dropped somewhere in the chaos. Outside, the sunlight was blinding. Grant's SUV waited with its back door open like a mouth. They were shoved into the seat, the door slammed shut. No one spoke during the drive. Walter watched the familiar world pass by through the window. The gas station where he'd taught Grant to pump fuel, the school Melissa had once attended, the church where Dean had been baptized. Each landmark felt like a goodbye. When the SUV finally slowed and pulled onto the shoulder of a remote stretch of road, Walter understood with a terrible clarity what was about to happen. Grant turned, his expression unreadable. "Get out!" And as Walter helped Evelyn from the car, his hands shaking, the engine idled behind them, patient, ready to leave. The SUV slowed without warning, tires crunching over gravel as Grant guided it onto the narrow shoulder of Route 19. The land stretched flat and exposed in every direction, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through fields bleached pale by summer heat. No buildings, no shade, just sky and road and the low shimmer of hot air rising from the ground. Grant put the vehicle in park and turned off the engine. The sudden silence rang in Walter's ears. "Get out," Grant said. His voice held no anger now, no hesitation either. It was the tone of someone closing a door he never intended to open again. Walter stared at him, waiting for something, an explanation, a flicker of doubt. But Grant was already looking past them, his hand on the door handle. Evelyn shifted beside Walter, her breath shallow and uneven. One side of her face had swollen badly, skin purpling beneath the dust that clung to her hair. Her white pins had come loose. Strands hung in her eyes, tangled and damp with sweat. Walter's ribs screamed as he moved. Each breath felt like glass. Still, he pushed the door open and stepped out first, planting his feet carefully on the uneven ground. He reached back for Evelyn, steadying her as she slid from the seat. Her knees nearly buckled, but she stayed upright, leaning into him. He felt how light she was, lighter than she should have been. Grant did not help them. He did not speak again. He closed the door, started the engine, and drove away. The SUV merged back onto the highway, its dust settling slowly as it disappeared into the heat. For a long moment, neither Walter nor Evelyn spoke. The sun pressed down on them with a physical weight, relentless and bright. The asphalt radiated heat upward, baking the soles of Walter's shoes. Evelyn's hand trembled in his. "They'll come back," she whispered, though there was no conviction in her voice. Walter watched the empty road. "No," he said quietly. "They won't." They began to walk. The first mile passed in silence. Walter focused on small things, the rhythm of his steps, the feel of Evelyn's arm around his waist, the sound of cicadas buzzing somewhere unseen. His head throbbed. His vision swam if he looked too far ahead. Evelyn breathed in short, careful pulls, each one edged with pain. When she stumbled, he caught her, his own balance barely holding. Cars passed. A pickup truck slowed briefly. The driver, a middle-aged man in a baseball cap, glanced at them through the windshield, then accelerated, dust spraying behind him. A sedan rolled by, windows up, air conditioning humming. Walter raised his hand once, then let it fall. He began to count without meaning to. 7 cars, 12, 19. Each one left behind a thin crack in something he had believed about people. The heat worsened. Sweat soaked Walter's shirt, stung his eyes. Evelyn's lips grew pale, her skin hot to the touch. She stopped suddenly, her knees folding. Walter lowered her gently to the ground, his chest burning as he knelt beside her. "Just rest," he said. "Just a minute." She nodded weakly, eyes half closed. Walter looked around, panic tightening his throat. There was no shade, no water, no sound but the road and the insects. He thought, absurdly, of the apple tree back home, of its cool shadow in late afternoon. He thought of how safe the house had once felt. When he stood again, he nearly fell. A dark shape crept into the edges of his vision. He took a breath, then another, forcing himself upright. He waved at the next car with both arms. It did not stop. The sound of air brakes came so suddenly that Walter flinched. An 18-wheeler loomed beside them, its massive frame casting a wide shadow across the road. The truck hissed as it came to a halt, heat shimmering around its tires. The driver's door opened, and a man climbed down slowly. Caleb Rhodes stood with the ease of someone used to height and weight. He was in his late 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a build shaped by years of climbing in and out of rigs. His beard was thick and streaked with gray, trimmed short but uneven, as if he'd cut it himself in a hurry. Deep lines bracketed his mouth, and his eyes, dark and watchful, held a careful kindness. He wore a faded flannel shirt, despite the heat, sleeves rolled to reveal forearms roped with muscle and old scars. He moved deliberately, keeping his hands visible as he approached, stopping a few steps away. "Hey," he said, voice low and steady. "You folks all right?" Walter swallowed. "My wife's hurt," he said. "We don't have a phone." Caleb's gaze moved to Evelyn, taking in the bruises, the way she sat slumped against the dirt, her breathing shallow. Something in his expression tightened. He crouched slightly, lowering himself to her level without crowding her. "Ma'am," he said gently, "my name's Caleb. I'm going to help you, okay?" Evelyn nodded faintly. Caleb turned to Walter. "I've got water in the cab, air conditioning too. Can you help her stand?" Walter nodded, though his hands shook as he lifted Evelyn. Caleb stepped in, taking some of her weight with practiced ease. He guided them toward the truck, opening the passenger door wide. Cool air rushed out, sharp and blessed. He settled Evelyn carefully onto the seat, then handed her a bottle of water, loosening the cap for her when her fingers fumbled. Walter climbed in last, his legs trembling. The door closed, sealing them in the quiet hum of the engine and the rush of cold air. Evelyn drank slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. Caleb pulled back onto the road, eyes flicking to the clock on the dash. He was already late. The delivery window was gone. He knew it the way he knew the lines of his own hands. For years he had lived by schedules, by miles and minutes. He had also lived with something else, the memory of a hospital room 3 states away, his mother's bed empty by the time he arrived. He had been running a contract then, too, had told himself he couldn't stop. He glanced at Walter. What happened? Walter spoke in pieces at first, the words coming slowly, shaped by pain and disbelief. As the story unfolded, Caleb's jaw tightened. His hands gripped the wheel harder. "No," he said quietly when Walter finished. "Not today." He reached for his phone and dialed. "I need the nearest hospital," he said. "Yeah, Briarfield. Thank you." The truck rumbled forward, the road unspooling beneath them. Walter leaned back, exhaustion crashing over him now that he no longer had to stand. He watched Caleb's reflection in the side mirror, the set of his shoulders, the determination etched into his face. For the first time since the SUV had disappeared, Walter felt something loosen in his chest. Behind them, the sun beat down on the empty stretch of Route 19, indifferent as ever. Ahead, the road bent toward Briarfield, toward sirens and questions and consequences. Caleb pressed the accelerator. The emergency entrance of Briarfield Medical Center glowed white against the darkening sky as Caleb eased the truck into the drop-off lane. The automatic doors slid open with a mechanical sigh, releasing a wash of antiseptic air. Nurses moved quickly, voices calm but urgent, hands already reaching for Evelyn as soon as they saw her face. Walter tried to protest, tried to stand on his own, but his knees buckled the moment he stepped down from the cab. A young orderly caught him before he fell, guiding him onto a gurney. Dr. Anika Shah met them inside the trauma bay. She was in her early 40s, slender and composed, with dark hair pulled into a low bun and sharp, observant eyes behind rectangular glasses. Her voice was steady, practiced, the voice of someone who had learned to separate panic from priority. She examined Evelyn first, her fingers gentle but precise, noting the swelling along her cheekbone, the discoloration spreading across her ribs, the cracked lips and sunken skin that spoke of dehydration. She then turned to Walter, listening carefully to his lungs, pressing along his side until he flinched despite himself. "You have at least one fractured rib," Dr. Shaw said to Walter, meeting his eyes directly. "Possibly two, and signs of a mild concussion." She turned back to Evelyn. "Your cheekbone is fractured, you're bruised along the ribs, and your kidneys are showing early signs of stress from dehydration and trauma." Her mouth tightened slightly. "These injuries are not consistent with a simple fall." Caleb stood near the wall, arms crossed tightly over his chest, jaw clenched. When the police arrived, he recognized the look immediately. Caution. Officer Briggs was first through the door, a broad man in his 50s with a weathered face and graying hair cropped close to his scalp. He carried himself with the weight of long service, movements economical, eyes measuring. Officer Park followed, younger, slimmer, with neatly combed black hair and a notebook already in hand. Park observed quietly, while Briggs asked questions in a tone that was careful, almost restrained. "Family disputes can get complicated," Briggs said, glancing at his partner, as if to underline the point. "Without witnesses, it's hard to establish." Caleb cut him off. He stepped forward, his voice rising for the first time since the truck had stopped on Route 19. "Hard to establish?" He gestured toward Evelyn, now resting against white sheets, her face mottled with bruises. "You think she did this to herself? You think a 71-year-old woman fractured her own face and then dragged herself 5 miles under that sun?" The room went quiet. Officer Park's pen paused mid-scratch. Dr. Shaw looked from Caleb to Briggs, her expression cool but unmistakably firm. "These injuries indicate assault," she said, "and neglect. Extended exposure to heat without water could have killed them." Briggs exhaled slowly, nodding once. "All right," he said. "We'll file a report." For Walter, the next hours blurred together. Pain medication dulled the sharpest edges, but not the memory. He lay awake in the narrow hospital bed, staring at the ceiling tiles, replaying the sound of the SUV door closing. Evelyn slept fitfully beside him, her breathing uneven, her hand wrapped in his. 2 days later, the case changed hands. Detective Nora Whitaker arrived without ceremony, her presence filling the small consultation room with a quiet authority. She was in her early 50s, tall and straight-backed, with steel-gray hair pulled into a tight bun at the nape of her neck. Fine lines traced the corners of her eyes, earned rather than softened by years on the job. She wore a plain navy blazer and sensible shoes, nothing about her appearance inviting conversation. When she spoke, it was with precision, each word chosen and placed. "I've reviewed the initial report," she said, looking directly at Walter and Evelyn. "I don't believe this was an isolated altercation." Caleb leaned forward. "There's a way to prove it," he said. "The SUV. Newer models track location automatically. If they check the GPS data," Whitaker's eyes sharpened slightly. "Already thought of that." Within hours, a warrant was issued. The data told its story in clean, unforgiving lines. Timestamps and coordinates mapping a deliberate path. The Harlan farmhouse. Route 19. A prolonged stop on the shoulder. Then a return to town. No detours, no emergency calls. The truth, rendered in numbers. Search warrants followed. Officers returned from Grant's house with evidence neatly bagged, Walter's wallet, Evelyn's phone, and a folder of legal documents printed the morning of the assault, unsigned but ready. Transfer of property, guardianship petitions, the pieces locked together with a clarity that left little room for doubt. "This wasn't a family argument," Whitaker said quietly as she laid the evidence out. "This was premeditated." While the investigation gathered momentum, Caleb's life quietly unraveled. His dispatcher called the morning after the hospital visit, voice clipped and formal. Missing a delivery without authorization violated company policy. By the end of the week, he was suspended. By the next, terminated. Caleb took the news without protest. He had known the cost the moment he turned the wheel toward Briarfield. Hank Morrow offered him a room at the Pine Rest Motel without asking many questions. Hank was a man in his late 60s, thick around the waist, with a walrus mustache and a voice like gravel softened by years of small-town courtesy. "You did the right thing," he said simply, sliding the key across the counter. "That counts for something." It counted more than Caleb expected. Word spread through Briarfield faster than he could track it. On the third day, a woman named Mabel Sutter appeared at the hospital carrying a foil-covered dish. Mabel was 82, stooped but stubbornly energetic, her white curls escaping a knitted cap, her eyes bright and curious. She set the casserole down on the bedside table like an offering. "No one should go through this alone," she said, patting Evelyn's hand. Then others came. Flowers, cards, quiet offers of rides and meals. A community, assembling itself around two people who had been discarded by their own blood. Caleb drove Walter and Evelyn to meetings with a local attorney, Tessa Lynn, a woman in her late 30s with sharp cheekbones, cropped dark hair, and an intensity that never tipped into cruelty. She spoke quickly, confidently, laying out options, protections, rights. "The house is yours," she said, "and we're going to keep it that way." As the evidence mounted, so did the pressure. Detective Whitaker stood in the corridor outside the ward one evening, phone pressed to her ear, listening. Her expression did not change, but her grip tightened slightly. "Yes," she said, "we're ready." She stepped into the room where Walter and Evelyn sat together, the hum of machines steady around them. "We're bringing them in," she said. Outside, somewhere beyond the hospital walls, engines turned over and doors opened. The machinery of consequence was finally in motion. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish, the kind of place where time seemed to move differently, measured in precedence and procedure rather than hours. Autumn had arrived quietly, leaves turning copper and gold along the sidewalks outside, and Walter noticed the sound they made when people walked over them, a dry whisper that followed every step. He sat beside Evelyn on the wooden bench, his back straight despite the lingering ache in his ribs. She wore a simple navy coat, her white hair neatly pinned again, the bruising on her face faded to yellow shadows. She looked smaller than she had before, but there was a steadiness in her posture that had not been there in months. Across the aisle, Grant sat rigid in his chair, jaw set, his suit impeccable. He looked much the same as always, controlled, polished, but the arrogance had drained from him, replaced by a tight, brittle focus. Melissa sat a few rows behind him, eyes red-rimmed, dabbing at them with a tissue she had already soaked through. Dean kept his gaze fixed on the floor, shoulders hunched, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles blanched. They did not look at their parents. The prosecutor, Rebecca Torres, rose when it was her turn. She was a woman in her early 40s, medium height, with dark hair cut sharply at the jaw and a voice that carried without effort. There was nothing theatrical in her delivery. She spoke the way people do when they trust the facts to speak for themselves. She laid them out one by one, the GPS data tracing a deliberate route, the medical reports detailing injuries inconsistent with an accident, the recovered wallets and phones, the unsigned transfer documents printed the morning of the assault. She introduced Caleb's testimony last, framing it simply: a citizen who stopped when others did not. The defense tried to fracture the story. They spoke of misunderstandings, of tempers flaring, of elderly parents losing their footing. They suggested mutual struggle, accidental injuries. Their words fell flat against the quiet weight of evidence. When Evelyn was called to the stand, the courtroom stilled. She walked slowly, carefully, her hand brushing the rail for balance. Up close, her age was unmistakable, but so was her resolve. She took the oath and sat, folding her hands in her lap. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft. It did not need to be louder. She described the drive, the heat, the emptiness of the road. She spoke of counting cars, of lifting her head each time one passed, of believing briefly, foolishly, that the next would stop. She told them about the thirst, the dizziness, the way Walter's hand shook when he tried to help her stand. She paused once, swallowing hard before finishing. "We thought we were going to die there," she said. "Not because of strangers, because of our children." No one moved. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped. The jury deliberated for less time than Walter expected. When they returned, the foreman's voice was steady as he read the verdicts. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Grant received the longest sentence. Melissa and Dean faced lesser penalties but were not spared consequences. Walter felt nothing like relief. The word justice hovered somewhere above the room, abstract and heavy. He watched Grant as the sentence was read, waiting for some sign: remorse, anger, recognition. There was none. Grant stared straight ahead, already sealed off. Evelyn reached for Walter's hand. He held it tightly. They left the courtroom together without looking back. The drive home took them past familiar landmarks made strange by time and absence. The Pine Rest Motel receded in the rearview mirror. Fields gave way to trees to the gentle slope where their farmhouse stood. Walter felt his breath catch as they turned into the driveway. The grass had been cut. The garden beds were cleared and edged, the rose bushes pruned. The porch steps, his steps, had been repaired, sanded smooth, their boards newly stained. A banner stretched across the railing, white letters bright against blue cloth. Welcome home, Walt and Evie. Evelyn stopped at the edge of the yard, one hand flying to her mouth. Tears spilled freely now, unguarded. Walter stood beside her, stunned. He recognized neighbors gathered quietly near the fence, people he had nodded to for years but never truly known. Among them was Mabel Sutter, leaning on her cane, smiling as if she'd been waiting all day. Hank Morrow stood near the porch, hands in his pockets, his mustache twitching with emotion. Caleb stood a little apart from the group, shifting his weight awkwardly, his flannel shirt clean but worn. He had shaved his beard shorter, though the gray still showed through. When he saw them, he lifted a hand in a small, uncertain wave. "You didn't have to do all this," Walter said when he finally found his voice. Mabel snorted softly. "Someone had to," she replied. They went inside. The house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and fresh bread. Cards lined the kitchen counter. A casserole sat warming in the oven. The walls seemed to breathe again. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft oranges and pinks, Walter, Evelyn, and Caleb sat together on the porch. The repaired steps held firm beneath their weight. Cicadas sang, the same song as always, steady and indifferent to human drama. Caleb rested his elbows on his knees, staring out at the yard. "I found work," he said quietly. "Local hauling. Not much, but it's steady." "That's good," Evelyn said. "I'm glad." He nodded, then hesitated. "I used to think stopping meant falling behind," he added. "All those years on the road, running from one deadline to the next. Turns out I was just running." Walter looked at him then, really looked. He saw the tired lines, the guarded kindness, the weight of a past mistake that had shaped the man sitting beside him. "You stopped when it mattered," Walter said. "That's not nothing." They sat in silence after that, the comfortable kind that didn't demand filling. The banner rustled gently in the evening breeze. Somewhere inside, the house settled, wood and nails finding their balance. "Family," Walter said at last, his voice low but sure, "is who stays." Caleb felt the words settle into him, deeper than any road or mile marker ever had. He understood then that saving Walter and Evelyn had been only part of it. In stopping, he had saved something in himself that he hadn't known how to name. The night closed in slowly, mercifully, leaving the porch light glowing warm against the dark.